left unsaid. Days that can't be counted by the time till rent. Tomorrow's just another like the one that comes next. The corner of the highway that leads to the job, at the desk by the boss with the elegant watch. The tick of the clock and the tick of the clock mark the moments till the ticking stops.
Today's podcast is with Jane Marie Chen, who is a globally recognized entrepreneur, inventor, speaker, and leadership coach. She is the co-founder of Embrace, which developed an infant incubator that has helped to save over 1 million babies. Jane has been a TED Fellow and a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, and she has a new memoir, Like a Wave We Break, a memoir of falling apart and finding myself. You're really going to enjoy the pod. Jane Chen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So as I was reading your book, I flashbacked to really, well, I didn't know it at the time, but it was a kind of a gift that I received as a young person growing up. So my dad was the culture guy in Chicago on radio and TV, a lot of celebrity interviews, movies, plays. I got to meet my fair share of famous folks. And something that dawned on me very early, I could see this, was how unhappy so many of these people seemed. They had fame and success, but that seemed to have little to do with happiness. And that was a gift because it gave me the insight as I got older and started working with a lot of celebrities at Second City to not assume that things like money or fame were an indication of a life filled with meaning, purpose, and contentment.
Yeah.
That strikes home for you?
Yes, definitely. I think, my work with Embrace was about building baby incubators for premature babies, some of the most vulnerable babies in the world. And so my life was really about helping the most vulnerable people. And that was deeply, deeply meaningful. And yet what I discovered through the course of my journey was that even as you go out and you do these great things, and I got so many accolades and recognition along the way, because I didn't have inner peace because of lots of things from my upbringing, I was not living a fulfilled life. Mm-hmm. And it ultimately led me to, extreme burnout.
You say in the prologue that, quote, this is the story of a wipeout, end quote. And I suspect from reading the whole book that you don't mean that, let me put it this way, that you mean that as almost a necessary way to get to the thing.
Yes.
Which is, yeah. And unfortunately for any of us who've been through grief and trauma, you got to go through it.
You absolutely do. So it starts as a wipeout, but that's not truly the story of the book because I end up recovering from that. But the book starts this moment into my journey 10 years in. I had been living in India India at that time was home to 40% of all the world's premature babies. And so my team and I had invented this low-cost baby incubator. We had set up shop there. I'd given my life, my soul to this mission for a decade. And at that point, 10 years in, I used the wipeout as a metaphor for what was happening in my life all around. I took a wipeout in the ocean. Surfing is a huge part of my life, but it was also this moment where the company collapsed and everything that had once defined me was gone. And so that really, it was the lowest point of my life, truly hitting rock bottom. But that is the beginning of my journey because it forced me to go on an inward journey and understand why I had been so driven and so motivated, and to start to explore, the deeper trauma that had led to my work and then to heal from that.
And I want to talk about that in a second, but when you talk about developing this product, and you were at the D School. We've worked with a bunch of folks there because design thinking and improvisation are very,
yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, so we talk about making you comfortable with being uncomfortable. Failure is a gift that you have here. We say you need to see all obstacles as gifts. It's a muscle that we build, which is very surprising, unusual to most people walking in because our cultures, and I'm by all our cultures, I mean a lot of cultures, not just the U.S. They don't celebrate those things. They think you shouldn't fail, and but you have to. There is no failure without success, and that was something I mean, that I think Carol Dweck's work was maybe some of the first stuff that introduced you to like, oh, I got to shift my mindset.
Totally. And I think that's one of the things I loved about being at the D school is that failures are not seen as failures. They're seen as opportunities for learning and growth. And that is indeed, what failures are. And what I often say now is that I believe your biggest breaking points or failures end up becoming your biggest breakthroughs.
Yeah.
Right? That they allow you to see the world in a different way. They really allow you to kind of go inward and shift your perspective. And so I totally agree with what you're saying.
There was a phrase I was I was working on a talk for somewhere, and I should resurrect this term because I haven't, but I talked about the idea of mindfully lingering inside a mistake. And it's this idea of like, if you can just let yourself live inside that area, it might not be a mistake. First of all, there might be a portal to something that's adjacent, all that
Yes.
stuff. And I think that's, it's in the same way. I've read some research around, I just read this in an upcoming podcast, but that in many ways for a disruptive future, leaders who have experienced depression will be more equipped to help us.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I really love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I agree. Actually, I just did a TED talk about resilience. And what I really have learned through my journey is that there is something actually quite beautiful about hitting rock bottom
Mm-hmm.
or about going through those depressive states. And I think when you resurface, you've done this deep reflection, right? You understand who you are, what drives you. And I think you're more aligned with your inner truth. And what I actually discovered through my process, and we can go more into the journey in a moment, but what I discovered was that resilience is not about kind of grit, which is, I think, how we've defined resilience for so
Yeah.
long, right? Like keep enduring and pushing harder. And I think it's what's led to this massive burnout epidemic in our country. What I've started to understand is that resilience is actually about self-compassion,
Yeah.
right? And that's what allows us to make mistakes and go through failure without punishing ourselves, without believing that the outcome defines our worth, right? And when we can separate that, then we actually become more courageous, more vulnerable. We're willing to take more risks. And all of the research on self-compassion actually supports this as well.
So let's go back to the beginning of this journey. So you were 4 when your family moved from Taiwan to Southern California. This is 1982. And what was going on in Taiwan was a period referred to as the White Terror.
Yes.
So what were you leaving before we talked about what you were coming to?
Yeah, so Taiwan was under martial law for 38 years, one of the longest periods of martial law ever. And there was so much violence and political oppression during that time. So hundreds of thousands of people were killed, imprisoned, disappeared. And that's what my parents were leaving. And so they were seeking, freedom of opportunity, of speech, of expression. And that's what led them to move us to America when I was 4.
And your parents had an arranged marriage. Now, I, I know when I was growing up and hearing about arranged marriages that they struck me as barbaric. And I get why, but I think I've softened over time on that. You're too close to it, but how do you feel about that aspect of that journey?
Well, it's funny because it was arranged in a sense, but not. I ended up living in India for 4 years, as I mentioned, and there are truly arranged marriages, and by that I mean people are meeting for the first time the day of the wedding. So
Yeah.
it wasn't arranged from that perspective, but my parents, their families had gone to matchmakers, and at that time, a lot of people were kind of set up based on similarity of family backgrounds, and so my parents, I think, only met a handful of times before they were engaged and didn't know each other very well at the time they were married. It's interesting, though, because I've heard statistics that arranged marriages actually have like more success rates in terms of not getting divorced, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like there's something to that. I'm not a proponent or, I don't know where I stand on it, but I do think there's kind of this like thing where in America, at least, or in the West, we have these like kind of Hollywood ideas of what romance should be. And then
Yes.
when a relationship doesn't fit that, it's almost like it could be a little easier to give up than to stick it through. That being said, we have to do what's right for us. I don't know if my parents were the best match, to be honest, but they're still married many, many years later.
So you didn't speak the language when you came here?
No, not at all.
All right. So you're the other in America that is not always hospitable to the other, as we know, living here in February 2nd, 2026. Sadly.
Yeah.
So what was your identity as a young person growing up at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I very much felt like I was the other. We lived in a pretty much all white neighborhood, and I was honestly like ashamed of my culture. I just wanted to fit in. I wanted to look at like everyone else. I remember thinking, gosh, if I just had like blonde hair and blue eyes, my life would be so easy. And there was a lot of racism in this country at that point, and so we ate different food. I looked different. I got made fun of because my eyes were slanted and my hair color was dark, and I just felt very much like the other. And so
Yeah.
I think that led to some like isolation and a lot of secrecy, just not wanting to do anything or reveal anything that made me stand out.
Yeah. And there was violence at home.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I imagine, and you write about it very tenderly, actually, because you don't know when you're in the middle of it that it's any different, and it wasn't maybe different in the culture that you were coming from, but it wasn't good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think to me, it was just a part of our culture, a part of growing up, but there was a lot of physical violence in my household. And it would take me many, many years to unpack how that affected me or to even realize that there was something to heal from. That's
Yeah.
how normalized it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot and the privilege that I grew up in because I'm the youngest of six boys, and my older brothers all had respectable careers, like they're going to be an architect or a stockbroker or whatever. And by the time I got to number six, and I'm like, I want to get into theater, and I probably have the only dad in America who said, "Finally!"
That's so
So
cool.
he was thrilled. Uh,
Yeah.
and I had no model for you can't. And when you have no model for you can't, you assume you can. And I'll actually never forget. I've told the story a couple times, but my wife Ann and I, she also works here. We've lectured at Stanford,
Hmm.
and my friend Tina Smith was teaching there, and she was writing. We met in the Quad for coffee, and she was talking about writing a book on luck. And Ann was saying like Kelly is the luckiest, like he can find a parking spot anytime. And she's like, and she said an interesting thing. She goes, I don't think Kelly is lucky so much as he assumes there's a spot for him and he sees it when it's there.
Oh, I love
Yeah.
that.
And you did not have, I mean, and you and I are both been very entrepreneurial in our careers and stuff, but you had to overcome that because you did not have that. I mean, they want you to be a doctor and yet like, and you came close, but not
Not
quite.
really. Yeah. Yeah, no, they wanted me to be a doctor. And I get it, just again, immigrant family, they've sacrificed everything. They want me to have like a steady, stable career. Growing up, I loved food. I loved cooking, and they put the kibosh on that really fast. And
That's
so I
no
was
good.
was not encouraged to do that. But then I did HIV/AIDS work in my early 20s and was just so drawn to this work, to humanitarian work. Something really pulled me to it. And then I went to Stanford for business school, and at the design school developed Embrace, the incubator. And again, just felt this calling, this deep passion, that fire in your belly to have to do something to help. And I didn't understand where it came from, right? And people would ask, like, why did you give up your whole life to do this? Why did you move to India? I had an MBA from Stanford. I could have done something far more cushy. And I could never really answer that. For 10
Mm,
years, I couldn't really answer. I just knew I had a drive. And so, to what you're saying, Kelly, this was less about, okay, there's a space for me and I can do it. But it was more just this, like, I'm going to do this no matter what, because
Yeah.
I believe so much in this. And so what I discovered over time was that, yes, that I had the fuel, the power to do this, but it also led me to working in really unhealthy ways, again, to the point of extreme burnout, to the point of pushing past all my limits. And it wasn't until the company failed that I connected the dots for the first time, that it was feeling so powerless throughout my whole childhood. That's what had driven me to want to help the most powerless people in the world.
Mm, mm. Uh, we've again talked about this in the podcast before, but it wasn't until I was in therapy and we did EMDR that I was suddenly realizing what my body was telling me when I suddenly became afraid to drive on highways. And this sort of discovery over a period of time that I like, and reading about generational. I mean, the amount of generational
Yeah.
trauma that you're drawing on, and it's funny because both my parents came from nothing,
Yeah.
and they came from violence. So my mom's dad was killed in a fight with a cop in Boston. My dad ran away
Mm.
from home. So I'm like, but my parents were lovely, and so but that, you can't really skip a generation with that stuff. And so you're not just dealing with what your parents brought to the table, but their parents and their parents and their parents. There's really good science around that.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I started to understand. And one of the things I really delved into in this book, like when I wrote the book, my intention was to write about every person with love and respect, right? And to tell my truth at the same time. And what that meant for me was also understanding my parents' upbringings, the history of Taiwan, the history of Japan. I'm also part Japanese. And I started to see very clearly, and I think this is so relevant to what's happening in the world today, but I started to see how violence and oppression makes its way into family systems and into
Yeah.
lineages and then into our society, right? And that is the effect of intergenerational trauma. And so I think it's upon us to kind of look deeply and to do that healing work so that it's not carried forward to the next generation.
Let's jump back to, I think it was when you were at Stanford, you were supposed to give a talk. So many people will relate to this, and you experienced it, but like I've seen stuff out there with people would rather like have a leg broken than give a talk in front of a group of people. And I so don't relate to that because this is like what I do all the time. But you had that fear as well, and it didn't go great. Your first
Yeah,
talk.
I was so nervous. I was sure I was the imposter, like the,
Mm-hmm.
the admissions mistake. I had major imposter syndrome. And so I was asked to do a talk my first quarter at Stanford. And I was like prepared, prepared, prepared. And then I got up in front of the room that evening, started the talk, and I literally blacked out. Like I just blank screen. I had no idea what I was going to say next. I had to leave the room.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mortifying, mortifying, because I thought, oh gosh, now everyone knows I'm not smart, I'm not good enough. And this haunted me for the next like 13 years. I had a really bad fear of public speaking for the next 13 years. And even though I did have to get in front of audiences for my work, I ended up relying on beta blockers, which is,
Yeah.
medication that helps with the physical symptoms of anxiety. And so it took me, it wasn't until probably like 3 years ago that I overcame that fear. And it was, very interesting, Kelly, because I did everything. I went to Toastmasters. I took an
Oh, you
improv
did
class.
everything. Oh my
Yeah,
God, this book is like,
yeah, everything. Like I went to an acting class. I remember I enrolled in an acting class at Stanford because I thought, gosh, if I could get comfortable with that, like, then I'll be okay. And I remember I explained to the teacher what was going on. I said, I feel like throwing up when I'm in front of an audience. And she was just like, well, then throw up. Like, what's the big deal? Just allow
yeah.
yourself to do that. But that didn't stick with me. And again, it wasn't until I really discovered self-compassion much, much later on that I finally got off beta blockers, and now I can stand up comfortably in front of an audience because whether I succeed or fail, even if I black out again, I know I'm okay, and that's what's given me kind of the courage to do so many things I wouldn't have once imagined.
So that Stanford talk, though, you came back in the room and finished the speech, and
Yeah,
people
I
liked
did.
it. So this is like, I feel like you were so close at that moment to not having to, like, because that's the thing we teach, of course, at Second
Yeah.
City, which is like, you are going to look ridiculous in front of these people. It is a very low risk place to practice high risk behavior. And
Yeah.
that's the high risk behavior is this and you talk about this in leadership, and I want to talk about that because it is this ability to be vulnerable. Because I mean, you know this now. I knew this much later than I wanted to in my career, which is what people want from their leaders is not this like unwavering certainty and success stories. They want to see that that person has had obstacles and they've overcome them and they're standing there to talk to them about it, and they'll share that and they'll be vulnerable. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is cry with your people.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But to me, a leader at that time, I was a first-time CEO when I started Embrace, and in my um, imagination, my perception of a leader is that you're so composed and buttoned up and perfect. And remember, I had grown up in an environment where like that's what I was taught. Don't show weakness, right? We're immigrants to this country. Don't show weakness. Don't show um, if you're sad or you're in pain. So I just learned to put on a smiley face no matter what. And so breaking in front of her, having this like moment of public failure felt just so scary. But I remember like at Embrace, about a year into living in India, the issue we were working on was so challenging and so emotional, but I started crying in a team meeting. And afterwards, I was mortified, so embarrassed. But my head of operations came up to me the next day and he said, Jane, thank you so much for being vulnerable. Because when you're vulnerable, it gives all of us permission to be vulnerable as well. And that's when I realized that, to what you said, true leadership isn't about being perfect and composed. It's about connection, it's about authenticity. And we can only do that if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable.
So before we get into sort of your journey that comes towards the latter part of the book, talk a bit about you're meeting with Obama, you're going to like whatever Davos adjacent thing is going on, you're in it totally, and the company is struggling, but you almost get bailed out in miraculous ways like 15 different times. And these are pretty bold-faced names. So talk a little bit about maybe some of that journey, because like I'm reading this thing going, oh well, they've got it now.
Yeah, well, we just faced like this was so much harder than any of us ever anticipated. Remember, we're coming out of Stanford. None of us have built a medical product. None of us have a manufacturing background, product design background. So we're figuring it out on the fly. And once we land in India, it's like you take a startup, which is already so challenging, multiply that by 100 if you're doing
Mm-hmm.
it in India. And then on top of that, a medical device helping babies, right? With all this like product liability regulations and everything, and then serving the poorest people in the world. So we're just like everything we're doing is so hard. And once we got there, the reality started to kick in. And so we face one challenge after the other, after the next, whether it's manufacturing, distribution, fundraising, everything you could think of, we faced it. But we were very lucky. Embrace definitely had 9 lives. And all the way up to the end, the work continues today. People stepped in and saved the company at the most serendipitous moment. I think one of the incidents you're referring to is sitting at Davos. We were about to sign a deal with a major distributor, and the funding got, or that deal, the plug got pulled on that in the last second. And so luckily, when I'd been at Davos, I'd attended this meditation session one morning that only 9 people showed up for. And I happened to sit next to Mark Benioff,
Yeah, there you
who's
go.
the founder of Salesforce. And Mark and I just started chatting afterwards. I told him about my work. He told me he had a personal experience with a premature baby. And both of us were sitting there like, oh my God, this is just so serendipitous that we're meeting in this moment. And so I reached out to Mark when that happened, and he saved the company. And that was, one of Embrace's 9 lives.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this story that happened. We were negotiating with a group in a hotel in New Orleans, and we're going to build a second city down there, but it was going to be music influence. So there'd be a trio rather than just a piano player. And we're like, oh, we'll explore. And I love jazz, so I'm like, this is going to be so cool. And I'm leading the charge, and I literally have the papers that I'm about to sign when I get an emergency phone call, and the box was like, Kelly, they say you got to so I got off whatever call, got on. They're like, you need to rip up the papers. It's not going to happen. Something had happened down there. And I was so distraught for like 2 days. And I was going on vacation because of the summer. And that's when Katrina hit. So we dodged a bullet. And it's like, you just don't know,
You just don't know.
There's either a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky story about this, which is like, this farmer who things keep happening to. And,
Yeah.
and it's like, you don't know. And some other door will open. And so in your telling of the story, it seems that the surfing thing is this sort of pivotal moment where you're sort of putting yourself in a position to get your ass kicked while exploring this new thing, but it also is immediately recognizable as a symbol. But and I had I want you to describe what Stoke is, and then tell us a bit about the surfing world of yours.
Yeah, well, Stoke is just like you are so excited to do something for the pure joy of it, And when I discovered surfing, I fell in love with it because it was so contrary to how I'd been living my life up to that point. And what I mean by that is everything was about like trying to control the outcome, trying to get to this one end goal and doing. Like I said, pushing harder and pushing harder. Surfing, you can't control the outcome. It's one of the greatest teachers of that. And the ocean I'm in the ocean every day. You can't control whether a wave comes or not, right? You can't control your conditions. You can prepare yourself to ride and to catch a wave, but there's so much of it that is about surrender, and learning that just allowed me to let go, to be more in flow, to enjoy the moment. When you're on a wave, you feel like you're flying. It's the best feeling in the world. It's pure ecstasy, but you're also totally present. And it's so visceral. Like you feel the wind on your face, the water against your skin, the smell of the ocean. It's so visceral that it forces you to be present in that moment. And for those 15 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, you're on a wave, you're in complete presence. And so that's what I learned, that it wasn't about worrying about the next thing that was going to happen. It wasn't about pushing harder. It's just how do you stay present? How do you be in flow? How do you let go? Right? So again, all things that were so different than the way I'd been leading my life.
So what's the chicken and the egg of that story? Did you think you needed to put it in your body, in your experience, your physicality before you could intellectualize it? Was it not linear like that? Was it going back and forth? Because this is dovetailing with this like wild journey you go on, trying every single like self-help thing you could possibly, get involved in.
Yeah. Well, I think it was just something that brought me such tremendous joy and play. And being at the D school, like the creative process of Embrace was the part I loved the most. And so it kind of brought me back to that feeling. And then as you said, it gave me a felt sense of what it meant to let go. Right. And the more I was learning that in this one part of my life, I think over time I was able to apply that to other parts of my life. And today I'm still learning that constantly.
Yeah. I mean, the awe part of it, right? I mean, because, when you're in an ocean, you can't help but not experience the awe. And then you have a much better sense of your lack of significance and utter significance.
Totally. Yes. I love that you said that because that's often what I feel when I'm in the ocean. It's like, I'm nothing. And when there's this Zen saying, when you become nothing, you become everything,
right,
so I often feel that. And every day I'm in the ocean now, after I surf, I just float and I feel the support of the ocean. I listen to the crackle of the sand. I watch the clouds take shape and I feel, just in awe, but I'm just like this little spectacle in this vast universe. And there's something about that that's very grounding,
All right. So how do you end up having Bessel van der Kolk as your therapist? This seems like no one lets you can't make. I almost got him on the podcast, but I didn't. So
I can put you in touch.
I'm in touch. I talked to the wife.
Okay, Alicia. Yeah. Well, so when Embrace collapsed, I hit rock bottom and I went on a healing journey. I packed up a surfboard, a suitcase, bought a one-way ticket to Indonesia. And I started exploring like every healing modality I could get my hands on. So that everything from psychedelics, I did all these self-help seminars, somatic therapy, frog poison ceremonies, all the things, and so but it wasn't, and I took a very design thinking approach. Like I had my list of modalities. If something didn't work, I'd quickly pivot to the next thing. And, I
It was
kind of
on
treated
Post-it
this.
notes.
Exactly. I had my post-it notes. I had a vision board. I had, the whole thing. But it wasn't until I read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk that I started to understand what had happened to me differently. And what Bessel talks about in the book is that trauma is not just something that happened in the past that you can keep in the past, which is how I had thought about it my whole life. Yes, these things happen, but let's move on, right? I've moved on. I have a career now, I have a life. Like I kind of wanted to sweep it all under the rug. But trauma actually rewires your brain and your nervous system, right? And so it's the way that you bring the past into the present, and it affects every part of your life. And this is why it's so imperative to look at these things more closely, because otherwise they affect you in ways that you're not even conscious of. And that was happening to me, through my work and my relationships. I was starting to see the repercussions and the effects more and more and more. Trauma also is not stored in our thinking brain, right? Which is talk therapy works with us at the level of the intellect. Trauma is stored in your limbic system, which is the part of your brain responsible for your emotions, for connection. It's a much older part of the brain. And that's why talk therapy just had never been effective for me. So anyway, I read this book, and it's an academic book, but I was just like in tears because I had self-compassion for the first time reading that book.
Yeah.
And I started to understand, okay, these things in my past affected me in such a fundamental way, that it's not just me being, reactive or irrational. There's a rhyme and reason to this, right? And so I decided I had to work with Bessel. And I basically stalked Bessel until he agreed to become my therapist. And that's how I started working with him.
Oh my God. So towards the end of that book, there's a section where they talk about, because his son was interested in improvisation, about different
Yes.
folks. Yeah. And, we're currently working with law enforcement at Second City with the University of Chicago Crime Lab to give them improvisational practices so they can practice the skill of pivoting, practice sort of resilient strategies, storytelling. And these are all sort of senior law enforcement for all over the country and all over the world too. There's international. And when we first started it, I was wary,
Yeah.
wondering how they would receive it. And we've now done 6 of these sessions. It is such a gift. I mean, literally, we hug when we leave. I don't think half these people vote like I vote, and it doesn't matter.
I love
It
that.
is human being, and this is the thing, that the noise of the times we live in, the polarization, is all being done at us, and it's so to our detriment, because for the most part, I turned 60 this year. My years have taught me that most people want to connect. Most people through difference can see good in others. Most neighbors won't discern
Yeah.
anything about you other than how can I help you. And it's like, I want that back so badly for all of us.
Absolutely. And there's so many common threads of humanity, regardless of what our political views are. And so to be really grounded in that. And, again, coming back to, I'm really big on this, as you can tell, but coming back to self-compassion and the research around self-compassion, what the research shows is that when we are kind to ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
we become far more capable of extending that compassion to others as well.
Sure.
Right. And so often, and this is kind of coming back to trauma, is when we come from things from a wounded place, we are more likely to act from a place of fear, ego, control, right? As opposed to when we act from a healed place, then we can act from love and compassion and shared purpose. And this is why, to me, it is so imperative that we do the inner work, that we find that kindness for ourselves, such that we can treat others in the same way. And that is the beginning of collective healing.
I was thinking about Annie Murphy Paul wrote a book called The Extended Mind. Do you know about this?
Mm-mm.
Oh, you'd love it. It's
Okay, I'll write it down.
she's a science writer and a producer for Hidden Brain,
Oh,
and
cool.
the extended mind is basically saying we have bad metaphors for the brain. We talk about it like a computer, and it is not.
Yeah, right.
It is our brain operates differently, whether it's outside or inside. A computer does not. And she had some research that she threw out that I didn't know, and I've worked in theater my entire life, and but I'm not an actor, but my son is, and so he verified that this is widely true. Is that most actors are finally memorizing their lines when they're blocking the show. So it's literally their need to move in a certain place allows them to memorize these lines. And while I recognize the limits of talk therapy, I think what you actually have going on is where all of these things meet. The narratives and the stories we tell ourselves in order to be kind to ourselves and kind to others, but also how our body has to move through space in order to fully process that whole thing. And it's more of an Eastern concept, but one that rarely gets considered in the West because it gets sort of thought of as woo-woo. But it's like, no, that's and I bet if you sort of examined your anyone who's into peak performance, that stuff's related.
I totally agree. And that's why, the body keeps the score, right? It's stuff is stored in our body. And I'm not saying talk therapy, is usually there's a place for it, it can be helpful to a certain extent, but I think paired with the somatic aspect, the movement, all of that, then you have something and you've done EMDR, right? And
Yeah.
so that's been so fascinating. That's been super helpful for me as well. So I think, again, it's understanding that it's more than just our thinking brain, right? How do we kind of activate these different parts of our body, our heart, our guts, right? And there's so much science now that shows there's actually more neural pathways from our heart to our brain than our brain to our heart. And the same thing as our gut, right? And so these things that we dismiss as like woo woo or whatever, they're actually grounded in science, and it's like part of human evolution.
Do you want to hear my EMDR discovery? It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were doing like tapping and some of this other stuff and sense memory
Yeah.
back and forth. And this was dealing with this sudden fear I had of driving on highways combined with like a fear of heights, which I think is rational, by the way. I've always had it, but it gotten slightly irrational. So we're maybe in session 3 or 4 in this thing, and I'm going back and it's like childhood memory. And the memory I drew upon, and this was the breakthrough, was the Sears Tower, I guess now called the Willis Tower, then the tallest building in the world, was just being finished. Again, my dad's a local celebrity in Chicago, youngest of 6 boys. We get to do a tour, and we get to the top, and my brother, who's an architect, goes out on the roof, and there's no guardrails. And I am terrified for him and screaming from, like the doorway until he comes back. And I swear I can even feel it right now. It just coursed through my body, this fear and this memory, and again, other stuff in there. But it was like, I had no idea that was hiding out. No idea. And the results were transformational with regard to that moment, the following week. I mean, it's like, it was like losing 25 pounds on my back.
Yeah.
So if you haven't gone through that, and look, anyone I've talked to about EMDR, they all have an experience. So it's just here to say, like, you'll find your thing, but like this stuff takes work.
It does take work, and something, because I really love to one of the reasons I wrote the book was to share my experiences with others, but also to give people resources. Not everyone can access all of these things. So I'll send you a link, but on my website, there's a resource page with free downloads, bunch of books, like exercises. I've taken the best things I've done and turned them into simple free exercises for people. But one of the things I often talk about, which you might be familiar with, is parts work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is also referred to as internal family systems, but the premise is that we all consist of a multitude of parts, right? So you, Kelly, there might be the overachiever part, the perfectionist part, the control freak part, the part that is the people pleaser, right? And then there's parts that carry fear and shame and some, more of the difficult emotions. And so the whole goal of this is, how do we start to recognize all these parts of ourselves? And instead of shaming or banishing any of them, to treat them with compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that part of me that was the overachiever, oh, that part was protecting the part of me that never felt like I was enough. And so instead of like shaming that part for like getting me to burnout point, can I just thank that part for the roles it's played in my life? And what I found is that the more I do this work, the more I have self-compassion, those parts become less activated. And then you can live your life from the place of your most genuine, true self. So it's a really, really beautiful practice. I encourage people who are interested to check it out. There's a book called No Bad Parts that really explains this so well.
You might dig this. We spoke to James Kimmel Jr. on the podcast, who's got a lab at Yale, and it's a book about the science of revenge.
Okay.
And he equates revenge with addiction.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he says, there's only one tonic to that, and it is forgiveness.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it was a really powerful, and he has this whole thing he does where he has historical analogies with regard to the Treaty of Versailles versus the Marshall Plan, to like, and this idea of, when you're forgiving, you are actually helping yourself. And that is a hard thing to recognize, because you think it's letting folks off the hook, and it's like, that's not what it needs to be. It is just like, you don't need to drink the poison anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And also, when we want revenge, it's because there's a part of us that's hurting.
Yeah.
Right. And we live in this society where we don't want to feel painful emotions. So we'd almost rather feel revenge than to feel that part that is like so in pain because we're hurting. Right. And so that's the other thing I've learned in this journey, coming back to so many things we've touched upon. It's like, to heal, we have to slow down enough to feel. Right. We have to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yep. All right. We always end the show with a yes and story. You got one for us?
Yeah. Okay. So just to be clear, this is a moment where I said yes to something and then like something
What
more
happened?
came out of it. Then, okay. Let's see. I have so many of these.
Yes, you do.
Well, I would say the biggest thing was saying yes to that point in my life 10 years in where everything collapsed. I didn't know what was next. I was at the lowest point, and I said yes to just packing up my bags and going out there. And I had no idea what was going to come about. And so was in what I call liminal space, like something significant had ended. I had no idea what was to come next. And it was really scary. And through that, I just, along the way, I think when you decide to take a big step like that and take the risk, I just came across the most beautiful, wonderful teachers, healers, people along the path that taught me forgiveness, that taught me love, that taught me self-compassion. I am so grateful that my company failed in that moment because it led me on a profound path and a way to helping others that I would have never anticipated.
The book is called Like a Wave We Break, a memoir of falling apart and finding myself. Jane Chen, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Kelly. So wonderful to chat with you today.